Welcome to the Horror Story channel, where nightmares come to life. Join us for spine-chilling tales of terror, creepy urban legends, and haunted places. If you're brave enough to face your deepest fears, hit the subscribe button and follow us on social media for our latest horror stories. Without any delay, let's jump right into the story. The Haunted Inn. The horse-drawn carriage made its way down the winding road, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. Sarah peered out the window, her eyes scanning the desolate landscape. She had never been to this part of the English countryside before, and she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in her chest. As the carriage drew closer to the inn, Sarah's apprehension grew. The building was old and weathered, its walls coated in a thick layer of moss. The windows were dark and foreboding, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder what kind of secrets the inn held within its walls. The carriage pulled up to the front entrance, and Sarah stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel driveway. Mrs. Hargrave, the innkeeper, emerged from the shadows, her sharp features illuminated by the dim light of a lantern. "Welcome to the Rose and Crown," Mrs. Hargrave said, her tone as icy as the winter air. "I hope your stay will be a pleasant one." Sarah tried to smile, but Mrs. Hargrave's unwelcoming demeanor put her on edge. She made her way into the inn, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The interior of the inn was just as Sarah had imagined it, dark, musty, and filled with old, creaky furniture. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and musty carpets. Sarah couldn't help but shudder as she made her way up the stairs to her room. As she settled into her room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to dismiss the feeling as her imagination running wild, but the strange noises that echoed through the walls made her uneasy. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she paced the room, trying to shake off the sense of dread that settled over her. Just as she was about to turn in for the night, she heard a faint whisper in her ear. Sarah spun around, but there was no one there. Heart racing, Sarah tried to convince herself that it was just the wind or her own imagination, but deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. The inn was haunted, and Sarah had a feeling that she was about to uncover a dark and terrifying secret. Sarah spent the next day delving deeper into the inn's history, determined to uncover the truth about the ghostly presence that haunted the inn. She visited the local library, where she pored over old newspaper clippings and historical records, searching for any information that could shed light on the inn's past. As she read through the old documents, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She felt a cold, prickly sensation on the back of her neck, as if someone was standing behind her. She turned around, but the room was empty. Shrugging off the feeling, Sarah continued her research. She discovered that the inn had a long and checkered history, with many guests coming and going over the years. But one name stood out to her, a young woman named Elizabeth, who had checked into the inn in the late 1800s and had never checked out. According to the records, Elizabeth had been found dead in her room, the victim of an apparent suicide. But as Sarah dug deeper, she began to suspect that there was more to the story than met the eye. She found a witness statement from a fellow guest who claimed to have seen Elizabeth arguing with someone on the night of her death, and another statement from a maid who had heard strange noises coming from Elizabeth's room in the days leading up to her death. Sarah's curiosity was piqued, and she decided to investigate further. She left the library and headed to the nearby village, hoping to speak with anyone who might remember the events surrounding Elizabeth's death. She knocked on doors and spoke with anyone who would listen, slowly piecing together a picture of what had happened. She learned that Elizabeth had been staying at the inn with her husband, but that they had been fighting constantly in the days leading up to her death. She also learned that there had been rumors of foul play, with some residents of the village suspecting that Elizabeth's husband had something to do with her death. As Sarah listened to the stories, she began to feel a sense of unease. It was as if the spirit of Elizabeth was still lingering in the village, seeking justice for her untimely death. Sarah's investigation had only just begun, but she was already feeling the weight of the history she was uncovering. She couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly presence she had encountered was somehow connected to Elizabeth's tragic fate. And she knew that if she was going to uncover the truth, she would have to delve even deeper into the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the haunted inn. Sarah woke up feeling anxious and restless. The previous night had been filled with strange noises and ghostly whispers that had kept her up until dawn. She felt a sense of urgency to continue her investigation, despite Mrs. Hargrave's warning. As she made her way downstairs to the inn's lobby, Sarah noticed that Mrs. Hargrave was sitting behind the front desk, staring at her with a cold, calculating gaze. "Good morning, Mrs. Hargrave," Sarah said, trying to sound polite despite her growing unease. "Good morning, Mississippi. Are you enjoying your stay here at the inn?" Mrs. Hargrave's tone was polite, but Sarah sensed an underlying hostility. "Yes, thank you. But I was wondering if you could tell me more about the inn's history." "I'm doing some research for an article," Sarah asked, hoping to gain some more insight into the inn's haunted past. "I'm afraid I don't know much about the inn's history. We've always prided ourselves on providing a peaceful and comfortable stay for our guests, and I don't believe in spreading rumors and hearsay," Mrs. Hargrave replied, her voice laced with a hint of warning. Sarah could feel her frustration growing. She knew that Mrs. Hargrave was hiding something, and she was determined to uncover the truth. "I understand your reservations, Mrs. Hargrave. But surely you must have some knowledge of the events that led to the rumors of the inn being haunted. Any information you could provide would be greatly appreciated," Sarah pressed on. Mrs. Hargrave's eyes narrowed, and Sarah could sense that she had hit a nerve. "I'm sorry, Mississippi, but I cannot divulge any information about the inn's past. It's better that you leave well enough alone and enjoy your stay here," Mrs. Hargrave said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. Sarah felt a twinge of frustration and anger. She had come too far to give up now, and she wasn't going to let Mrs. Hargrave stand in her way. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Hargrave. But I have a duty as a journalist to report the truth, and I won't be deterred by anyone. Thank you for your time," Sarah said before turning on her heels and heading back to her room. As she climbed the stairs, Sarah could feel Mrs. Hargrave's icy glare following her. She knew that she was in for a fight, but she wasn't going to back down. She was going to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Sarah's investigation into the inn's history had taken a disturbing turn. The encounters with the ghostly presence that had started as mere whispers and shadows were now more frequent and intense. Sarah was starting to fear for her sanity as the visions and nightmares became more vivid and terrifying with each passing night. One particularly eerie encounter had left Sarah trembling and gasping for breath. She had been in the middle of her research, poring over old documents and yellowed newspapers, when she had felt a cold breeze wash over her. Looking up, she had seen a figure standing in the corner of the room, shrouded in darkness and mist. At first, Sarah had thought it was a trick of the light or a figment of her imagination. But then the figure had moved, gliding silently towards her with an otherworldly grace. Sarah had frozen, too scared to move or scream, as the figure had come closer and closer. And then it had vanished, leaving Sarah alone in the dark and eerie silence of the inn. But the worst was yet to come. That night, Sarah had a nightmare that felt more real than anything she had ever experienced before. She dreamed of the inn's haunted past, reliving the tragedy that had claimed the life of a former guest. But this time, the ghostly presence was there, watching her from the shadows with a cold and malevolent gaze. When Sarah woke up, she was covered in sweat and gasping for breath. She realized that the ghostly presence was trying to communicate with her, using her dreams and visions to reveal its story. But what did it want? And why was it so angry and vengeful? Sarah's investigation had taken on a new urgency as she sought to uncover the truth behind the ghostly presence. But as the encounters became more frequent and the nightmares more vivid, Sarah began to fear that she might never leave the inn alive. Sarah sat in the dimly lit parlor, staring at the evidence spread out before her. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, revealing a dark truth about the inn's past. She had uncovered a letter from a former guest, detailing a horrifying encounter with the innkeeper's son. The letter described how the young man had murdered the guest and buried their body on the premises, creating the ghostly presence that haunted the inn. As she pieced together the evidence, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The inn seemed to be closing in around her, its walls echoing with the sounds of ghostly whispers and creaking floorboards. She knew that Mrs. Hargrave was hiding something, and she was determined to confront her with the truth. Sarah made her way to the innkeeper's quarters, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked on the door, her hand shaking with fear and anticipation. When Mrs. Hargrave answered, Sarah could see the fear in her eyes, a stark contrast to her usual stoic demeanor. "What do you want?" Mrs. Hargrave asked, her voice shaking with apprehension. "I know what you've been hiding," Sarah said, holding up the letter. "I know about the murder." Mrs. Hargrave's face went white as a sheet, and she stumbled backwards, collapsing into a chair. "How did you find out?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah explained how she had pieced together the evidence and confronted Mrs. Hargrave with the truth. She demanded to know why Mrs. Hargrave had covered up the murder and kept the inn open despite its dark past. "It was my son," Mrs. Hargrave said, tears streaming down her face. "He was troubled, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't bear the thought of losing him, so I covered up his crime and pretended that nothing had happened." Sarah felt a surge of sympathy for Mrs. Hargrave, but she knew that the inn's dark past could not be ignored. She urged Mrs. Hargrave to come clean and face the consequences of her son's actions. As they spoke, Sarah could feel a presence in the room, a ghostly force that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing moment. She realized that she was in grave danger and made a desperate attempt to escape the inn. As she fled through the dark, winding corridors, Sarah could hear the ghostly presence pursuing her, its icy breath sending shivers down her spine. She burst through the front door of the inn, gasping for breath, and stumbled into the night. As she looked back at the inn, she could see the ghostly figure standing in the window, its eyes fixed on her with a haunting intensity. She knew that the spirit would continue to haunt the inn, waiting for its next victim to cross its path. Sarah's heart raced as she stumbled out of the inn, her mind still reeling from the encounter with the ghostly presence. She could feel its icy breath on the back of her neck, the weight of its gaze following her as she fled into the night. She collapsed on the ground outside the inn, gasping for air as she tried to shake off the terror that had taken hold of her. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, a steady, ominous beat that seemed to echo through the empty countryside. As Sarah regained her composure, she realized that she had to get as far away from the inn as possible. She stumbled to her feet and began to run, her legs carrying her as fast as they could go through the dark, winding roads of the countryside. Eventually, she found herself back in the safety of her own home, the comforting familiarity of her surroundings a balm to her frazzled nerves. She collapsed onto her bed, exhausted and trembling, unable to shake the feeling that the ghostly presence was still following her. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah struggled to come to terms with the horrors she had experienced at the inn. She poured herself into her work, researching and writing about the haunted history of the inn, hoping that her article would serve as a warning to others. But despite her efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly presence was still out there, waiting for its next victim. She became increasingly paranoid, jumping at every sound, and spending her nights huddled under the covers, afraid to close her eyes. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, she heard a faint whispering coming from outside her door. It was a low, raspy voice, almost indiscernible, but unmistakably the voice of the ghostly presence she had encountered at the inn. Her heart racing, Sarah mustered all the courage she had and crept towards the door. As she approached, the whispers grew louder, and she could feel a cold breeze blowing in from underneath the crack at the bottom of the door. With a trembling hand, she slowly pushed the door open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. But even as she breathed a sigh of relief, she could feel the weight of the ghostly presence still hovering over her, its icy touch lingering on her skin. And as she closed the door, locking it tight, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly presence was still out there, waiting in the shadows, biding its time until it could claim its next victim.